Well, good morning, and I'm really delighted to welcome Rich Adler to our meeting this morning. Rich is a software architect who has been involved with essentially the decision-making process, both from the point of view of business decisions and policy decisions, as in the sense of Homeland Security and other such activities. And I'm just delighted, Rich, that you are joining us today to talk about the essentially violating, or if that's the right word, the law of unintended consequences by being smart about it in decision making. Rich has a BS in physics and philosophy from the University of Michigan. He's a master's degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana, and a PhD in physics from the University of Minnesota. Now that is a Big Ten pedigree. I gotta say, that's impressive, Rich. I'm a Buckeye and a Nittany Lion, so I sort of resemble that experience. But welcome to the Wilson Forum, and Rich, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Ron. Thanks for inviting me. Good morning, everyone. And I have to make one correction. It's actually PhDs in philosophy of physics. So I'm a doctor of philosophy.
Oh,
but that's a topic for another time.
Okay.
All right. So I'll get started. We have a lot of material to cover. In 2020, I published a book entitled Bending the Law of Unintended Consequence. This presentation provides an overview of the book's central themes. There we go. My talk will address, are you seeing the second slide?
Yeah.
Okay, great. My talk will address three topics. First, what are critical decisions and why do they go awry so frequently? Second, how can you improve critical decisions and their outcomes? And I call my answer to this important question the decision test drive method. And then third, I'll actually illustrate the test drive method in practice with a case study. And I'll focus on decisions about managing risk, a major problem that vexes business and government enterprise alike. You can think of these three segments as diagnosis, treatment, and praxis. Decision makers tend to downplay or ignore diagnosis out of the desire to act quickly. But suppose that you're a physician who misdiagnoses a patient's symptoms. Then the treatment you prescribe will probably not cure their actual underlying condition. Decision making is similar. If you don't understand why critical decisions turn out badly, it's very difficult to improve outcomes. To give you some context, my approach to decision-making draws from several fields, including cognitive psychology, economics, sociology, and management theory. The key breakthrough is the idea of a decision test drive, which combines scenario planning with dynamic modeling and simulation techniques, plus a pinch of AI and knowledge management thrown in. Dogs like this contemplative dachshund live in the moment. Their decisions are short-term and narrowly bounded in scope. My book focuses on what I call critical decisions, which pose entirely different challenges. Critical decisions are made by organizations, such as businesses, government agencies, nonprofits, and other institutions. They focus on enterprise-scale strategic or operational issues. Examples of critical decisions made by businesses include what kind of goods and services to produce, who to market to and sell them to, and how. Mergers and acquisitions, divestitures, going public, financing, things like downsizing, restructuring business units, hiring, compensating, and succession planning of executives, and switching out core processes, enterprise IT systems or technology platforms. In addition to dealing with these organization-centric challenges, government leaders and managers have to deal with critical decisions to assure the well-being and security of their societies. Common examples of decision train wrecks are legion. Entrepreneurs building B2B net markets pursued a disruptive business model that exploited the internet to rework industrial supply chains. Over 1,000 net markets sprouted during the dot-com boom. Virtually none of them survived the dot-com crash in 2001, done in by over-optimism, overconfidence, and a misreading of industry dynamics. M&A transactions have a notoriously high failure rate, seriously overpromising and underdelivering results. AOL Time Warner is a poster child for M&A train wrecks, producing a staggering loss of $200+ billion in shareholder value. This decision in 2000 was a perfect storm of bad analysis, bad timing, and bad execution, including a major failure to manage cultural change. Early retirement programs shrink workforces. This is a downsizing strategy that's very popular in tough economic times because it incentivizes workers to leave voluntarily. However, in practice, EROs are deceptively hard to design and execute. For example, DuPont carried out a notable ERO in the mid-1980s to cut costs in a stagnant economy. But their program was oversubscribed by fully 100%, which doubled costs over their plan. And to add insult to injury, the ERO produced a serious drain of expert knowledge that impacted operations and proved difficult and very expensive to correct. So in short, critical decisions fail because they're deeply flawed at inception or go off the rails as they're being executed. Decision debacles such as failed M&As occur with some regularity, and they're very well documented. And yet even leaders with successful track records continue to make critical decisions that run aground. So why does this happen, and what can be done to fix the problem? Well, let's start with saying what makes a decision critical. I propose 4 criteria. They entail significant risk. If you screw them up, they'll likely damage, cripple, or kill your business and likely harm your career. They also impact diverse stakeholders, including customers, investors, employees, and competitors. We often have limited knowledge about the agenda and behavior of these parties. They play out over years or even decades. Consider, for example, decisions to develop drugs or energy assets. And their impacts extend beyond organizational boundaries into markets or the economy at large. So what are the implications of these factors? Why do they make decisions so hard? Well, to start, they give rise to complicated objectives with multiple metrics that often conflict. So that requires hard trade-offs. They feature many moving parts. This makes allocating resources and choreographing schedules of interdependent activities to implement decisions very complicated. Doing nothing is not a safe fallback or default. Consider, for example, the shareholder losses following Yahoo's decision to reject Microsoft's takeover offer in 2008. They're not amenable to standard analytical tools, including operations research and the current silver bullets of big data, predictive analytics, and machine learning. The simplifying assumptions required to use these tools on critical decisions renders results patently unrealistic. And to add insult to injury, critical decisions occur with relatively low frequency, which makes it hard for most organizations to build and maintain internal expertise. The test drive method was designed expressly for critical decisions. However, you can often apply the ideas underlying the test drive method to non-critical decisions, such as personal life choices and routine operational decisions. So there are 2 schools of thought today as to why critical decisions go awry so often. Psychologists and many management consultants point to biases in our thought processes. These are produced by emotions, feelings, values, and intuitions that distort our judgments and choices. The famous gut instincts that leaders take such pride in are saturated with cognitive biases. By contrast, decision scientists gravitate towards bounded rationality as the explanation. They assert that human beings simply lack the cognitive horsepower to formulate or select alternatives that are optimal, at least in the complex environments that typify critical decisions. I believe that both views are flawed because they're incomplete and siloed. The answer is not one or the other theory, but a combination of the 2. Greek mythology offers a good analogy. Homer's epic The Odyssey describes a narrow strait dominated by 2 monsters, Scylla, a multi-headed serpent, and Charybdis, a horrific whirlpool. Odysseus was forced to sail through this strait to return home. Critical decision makers face a similar dilemma, surviving dual lethal menaces of biases and cognitive rationality. Incidentally, this story is the origin for the expression caught between a rock and a hard place. In my book, I argue that critical decisions go awry because of the law of unintended consequences, stated here. Robert K. Merton, a prominent American sociologist, christened the law back in 1936 and provided the first formal analysis of its causes. He identified 5 causal factors that would be recognized now as cognitive biases and bounds of rationality. Merton was the first to understand that if you ignore either cluster of factors, you'll provoke the law. Equally important, Merton's causal diagnosis points the way to defend against the law and improve critical decisions, as I'll discuss shortly. Unfortunately, Merton was decades ahead of his time, and his ideas did not catch on widely. So my book attempts to revive and extend Merton's seminal work. Theory of cognitive biases was developed by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman starting in the late 1960s. Biases stem from the intuitions that allow us to respond to everyday situations quickly and with minimal data. But these shortcuts tend to be unreliable and misleading in complex situations. Psychologists have identified over 180 distinct biases, but they can be grouped into 6 broad categories. Pattern recognition biases affect the way we gather and interpret data, such as seeing patterns or stories where none exist, and the well-known confirmation bias. Action biases incline us to cut corners in making decisions and act precipitously or over-aggressively. Over-optimism is an example. Stability biases dispose us to delay or refrain from action out of inertia or fear, such as aversion to loss. Interest biases lead us to make decisions that favor ourselves or our teams over the greater good, while social biases stem from group-based dynamics, such as a desire to avoid conflict in meetings. Finally, dynamic biases stem from deficiencies in our cognitive capabilities to understand causal relationships and predict change over time. So this includes things like feedback loops. Herbert Simon, an economist, among other things, first identified the causes of bounded rationality in the 1950s. They include these factors: our inability to collect complete data about our current situation, our imperfect social scientific knowledge for predicting how situations will evolve, the inherent complexity of markets and other social contexts, uncertainty about the future, human error, and the pragmatic problem of we generally don't have enough time or budget to do a really good job making decisions. One last piece remains to complete the diagnostic puzzle of why critical decisions go awry so often. We tend to think of decisions as discrete events, which are often dramatic and stressful, but decisions are actually processes that extend over time. The activities leading up to the unjustly celebrated point of decision are no less crucial than the choice itself. They're like prep work in home projects, such as painting or tiling. If you're sloppy or careless, the job won't hold up. Skillful execution is just as important as diligent preparation, because your environment continues to evolve while you implement a decision. These changes can invalidate your original assumptions and trigger unintended outcomes. To avoid this, you must monitor both the performance of your decision and situational changes, and be prepared to adjust your decision to ensure successful outcomes. So we're now in a position to answer the question of why the law of unintended consequences is so deadly and pervasive. Its diverse causes impact all the various steps of the critical decision-making process, and their effects are all different. The train wrecks described earlier, and many more ill-fated critical decisions, all trace back to unintended consequences caused by biases and reasoning constraints that arise when we confront choices in complex situations. In short, if you don't approach both classes of threats systematically, you're likely to have a close encounter of the nasty kind with the law. This brings us to the second part of my talk, or treatment. The law of unintended consequences is implacable and congenital. It's part of the human condition, and you can't really avoid or break it. You can, however, reduce the frequency and severity of its effects, effectively bending the law. This requires some effort and a coordinated campaign on two fronts. First, you must defend against cognitive biases. The key here is to override wayward intuitions through deliberate, disciplined thinking. But this isn't sufficient. You can compensate for biases until the cows come home. Simply defending against poor judgments and choices doesn't ensure great outcomes. It merely reduces the likelihood of avoidably bad ones. To bend the law, you must go on the offensive and actually improve the decision. The second front is a tougher nut to crack. Bounded rationality precludes predicting the future reliably. So we have to focus instead on the more modest objectives of anticipating plausible futures and exploring the possible consequences of decision options in those futures. This is the crux of the test drive method in bending the law. Better anticipation means fewer unintended consequences because it exposes possible threats early, enabling you to take steps to avoid or mitigate them. Anticipation can be improved by leveraging decision sciences and computers, specifically modeling and simulation software tools that incorporate what-if scenarios, enhance and scale deliberate thinking about critical decisions beyond what we can do with our little doggy brains alone. So, debiasing is a recent buzzword that refers to techniques for overcoming cognitive biases such as misleading intuitions. For example, you can compensate for action biases through an exercise called premortems. A premortem starts by assuming that your sure-thing decision has somehow gone horribly wrong. Now imagine what could have caused such a train wreck, such as faulty assumptions, unexpected events, or execution errors. So in effect, premortems sober you up from action biases such as overconfidence, overoptimism, neglecting contingency, and discounting your competitors. Time doesn't permit a review of the debiasing techniques recommended to counter all the biases. So instead, I'll just make a few observations. First, don't attempt to defend against individual biases, particularly on an ad hoc basis. There are just too many. They're like the mythical harpies or furies. So instead, combat them as categories, the 6 groups I talked about before. This works because biases in each category tend to be amenable to similar techniques. Leverage the power of work teams. It turns out that different people have different susceptibilities to each bias. So use work teams to trap and defend against each other's vulnerabilities. Third, treat biases as a quality control problem. Industrial machines perform with small variations inevitably that introduce defects into production processes. What quality control does is focus us on improving individual process steps to minimize the variations that reduce overall yield. So in our context, think of people as the machines and biases as the sources of defects in judgments and choices. To defend against cognitive biases systematically, you must harden your decision-making process as a whole by integrating relevant debiasing techniques such as premortems into each process step. Now, dynamic biases are relatively neglected in the literature, and they're generally less susceptible to debiasing techniques. So defending against them requires powerful tools, such as the simulations built into our test drive method. The second front of the campaign to bend the law, recall, requires going on the offensive against bounded rationality. This is where decision test drives enter the picture. So consumers test drive cars or trucks to experience firsthand their handling, power, comfort, and visibility prior to buying them. Granted, road tests are imperfect predictors. The actual vehicle you buy may have defects or it might age badly. Nevertheless, test drives offer a quick, simple means to reduce the risk of mistake and disappointment for costly purchases. Decision test drives play an analogous role for critical decisions. Instead of cars, you test out multiple decision options, and you test them against plausible futures rather than performing driving maneuvers on different kinds of roads. Diversity is crucial because the law rears its ugly head when you bet on decisions that are brittle. That is, their success depends on a specific future coming to pass. As I said, predicting the future correctly is virtually impossible. However, conceiving a range of plausible futures is eminently feasible, and anticipating how alternative decisions might play out in those futures reduces the risk of collisions with the law. In addition, comparing projected outcomes highlights the relative strengths and weaknesses of competing alternatives. So this allows you to improve promising options by eliminating underperforming decision elements and adding attractive components borrowed from other alternatives. Part of the assault on bounded rationality is to improve anticipation of decision outcomes. The central question is, what will happen if we do X and the world evolves along path Y? To be effective, decision test drives must account for three distinct types of dynamics. First, what processes is your organization currently carrying out, and what new actions will it have to undertake to execute your critical decision? Second, how might conditions evolve while you are implementing your decision? The usual suspects here include disruptive events, such as new market entrants, trends such as the rate of market growth, and forces such as increased access to new technology. Third, what are other decision stakeholders currently doing and how might they respond to situational changes? This includes competitors' reactions to your prospective decisions. So projecting decision outcomes is analogous to plotting a boat's course across a lake. Sailors can't just aim straight at their desired target point on the opposite shore. Instead, their navigation plan must account for the prevailing winds and currents. This is similar for critical decisions. You must consider what might happen while you execute a candidate decision, not just the anticipated end state. Anticipating the details of situational dynamics is particularly important when they act non-linearly over time, or when the future diverges from the past, for example, due to disruptive changes in technology. So, how do you actually test drive a critical decision? Fasten your seatbelts. So we start with a baseline description of your current situation, including your environment, your current state, and other parties of interest. The baseline must also incorporate metrics that allow projected outcomes of decision options to be compared. Next, copy that baseline scenario and extend each such copy with the what-if assumptions about the market, social and government influences that will define a distinct plausible future. Now is the time to define your set of alternative decision options in sufficient detail to allow simulating their execution. The primary task here is to create a schedule for the activities that need to be performed for implementation, along with estimates of how each such activity will move the dial on your performance metrics. Okay, copy each of the plausible futures, inserting one of these alternate decisions into each. So this is basically an exercise of combinatorics. I call the resulting models dynamic scenarios. Each such model amounts to a script for a movie of one decision option in one plausible future. Project their outcomes and compare. Finally, we apply a rule to select the best decision. The goal is to identify a decision option that produces the most attractive outcomes across a broad range of plausible futures. In this case, it's number B, while avoiding any train wrecks. This decision will likely be suboptimal in formal economics terms. However, it will be robust in the face of uncertainty and thereby minimize exposure to the law. This is a crucial point. Robustness is the primary goal of the decision test drive method. Competing techniques seek to identify the best performing decision, assuming the most likely future obtains. By contrast, the test drive method works to find a decision that outperforms competitors across diverse futures while avoiding or mitigating what could possibly go wrong. I believe that this decision support method and tools are unique. By now, I've probably triggered your flight instinct, but the mechanics of test driving critical decisions isn't nearly as intimidating as they sound, so don't panic. The process is actually very similar to working with spreadsheets. Other companies or people do the heavy lifting of building the spreadsheet engine and developing worksheets to model the task at hand. The job of end users is confined to populating the input cell in the worksheet with their data, performing some what-ifs and analyzing and comparing options. Analogously, the infrastructure for Decision Test Drive consists of a pre-existing software platform and templates for dynamic scenarios. The platform I built consists of a modeling framework and user interface, a simulation engine, and analytical tools. I create test drive templates in collaboration with expert decision makers. They're like worksheets on steroids. A template provides a best practices skeleton for test driving one type of critical decision. It specifies the minimal required data inputs, the key performance metrics to track, the elements for formulating a competent decision option in that domain, and relevant situational dynamics. So for this apparatus, end users are typically mid-level analysts or consultants. They should be competent in the decision domain, but they need not be experts. The knowledge embedded in the dynamic scenario templates insulates these end users against diverse biases, such as collecting data and making assumptions. The key point here is that the test drive method is agnostic with respect to decision domains. If a decision satisfies our conditions for criticality, it's generally worthwhile and feasible to test drive. My book describes example test drives for 4 types of critical decisions, shown here. I'll describe the risk management test drive shortly. Recall that the execution phase of the decision-making process is a tempting target for the law in its own right. So you must defend against the law's ravages after the point of decision to ensure success. I call this the early warning system mode because by the time you get to execution, you already own your decision. It's too late to test drive it again. So here's a basic idea. You've made your decision. Suppose you're now several months into executing it. What you need to do is update your original dynamic scenarios to reflect your current situation. So this involves throwing out scenarios that no longer seem plausible and adding new scenarios to reflect your current uncertainties about the future. You must also revise them to reflect the fact that some of your scheduled decision actions have already been completed and produced results. Now you rerun the simulator on this updated set of dynamic scenarios for your chosen decision. If the projected outcomes are all favorable, you can relax and take a nap. If not, then you need to diagnose the shortfalls to identify their causes and adjust your decision to mitigate or avoid these impending threats. Repeat this process periodically or when any disruptive events occur. So, conducting test drives plus using this early warning system supports decision makers across the entire decision life cycle, not just the point of decision. So we've come to my third and last topic, what a decision test drive looks like in practice. I'll use critical decisions for managing organizational and societal risks for our example. I'll start by explaining our general approach to dynamic modeling of risk, and then review the details of a specific risk decision test drive. Risk can be defined as the potential for undesirable outcomes, including financial losses, injury or death, and damage to property or reputation. Enterprise risk management, or ERM, is a branch of decision science that seeks to minimize exposure to risks through 2 closely coupled activities. First, risk analysis identifies and assesses threats that generate risks. What causes threats? That is, what conditions or event sequences are required to generate a threat, and how does it cause harm? For example, cyber threats are carried out through various attack modes, such as ransomware, phishing, and denial of service. These modes gain attackers access to websites or computer networks, where they can steal data or compromise operations in various ways. Analysis also quantifies potential risk losses, typically in monetary terms. So risk is estimated most commonly as the likelihood of occurrence of a threat multiplied by the estimated magnitude of expected harm or losses, denominated in dollars. The second core activity in ERM, risk management, prescribes policies and allocates resources to prevent, mitigate, or recover from harm. Note that effective management presupposes a thorough analysis of risk. Resources are almost never sufficient to address all salient organizational or societal risks. By quantifying them, analysis allows risks to be compared and prioritized. This facilitates the assignment of scarce resources to where they'll provide the most benefit. And understanding how threats arise and cause losses is similarly vital to developing measures to avoid them or mitigate and recover from their effects. Our approach to modeling ERM decisions leverages portfolio theory, a technique introduced by economist Harry Markowitz in 1952 for managing ROI, or return on investment, for a diversified set of financial products. Markowitz considered a set of asset classes such as stocks and bonds, their expected rates of return over time, and their variances. He used variance, which is simply the range of variation in prices historically, as a statistical proxy for the volatility or risk in asset values. Given these inputs, Markowitz identified a set of efficient portfolios, which is simply allocations of assets that maximize ROI relative to investor appetites for risk in each asset class. Our approach effectively flips or inverts Markowitz's ROI and denominator while retaining his type of optimization calculation. That is, Markowitz tried to maximize profit from a set of investments constrained by appetite for risk. What our ERM test drive model does is it seeks to maximize the risk reduction that can be produced from a fixed budget. In effect, the goal is to get the best bang for your risk reduction buck. Now, you have to keep in mind that ERM is essentially a type of insurance. As such, ERM strategies don't generate bottom line growth or increase profits. This means that ERM typically draws a short straw when competing for scarce resources and budgets, be it in businesses or government agencies. So a portfolio approach that optimizes yield from whatever constrained resources are allocated for ERM is an attractive approach for improving these decisions. So here's a simple way to think about portfolio-based ERMs. This is the core of our test drive. Start with two constructs: threat scenarios, which simply specify the types of threats that are expected to arise, natural disasters like floods and terrorist attacks, and target populations. These are the entities that are impacted by the threat scenarios. A population can be a single thing, an enterprise or society, or an asset, such as a building, computer network, or vessel. More often, it's a set of things, such as the employees of a firm, a fleet of trucks, or all businesses that participate in a market. Now combine these two ingredients to map out a grid. Cells in the grid are called risk exposure segments. Each segment represents one target population vulnerable to one threat scenario. The size of each such cell represents its total risk, which simply equals the amount of risk per individual target times the size of the target population. Note that some populations aren't vulnerable to some threats. For example, buildings inland from a port aren't vulnerable to boat bombs, so grids are often somewhat sparse. So now think of such grids as risk gaming tables. In this model, an ERM decision consists of a bet that places one or more chips on the risk gaming table. Each chip represents an allocation of resources, capital assets, personnel, and activities that are directed at reducing risk in one segment. Many ERM risk reduction measures combine chips, which can then be treated as a single recurring unit for convenience. For example, one airport security line bundles scanning equipment, a team of security officers, and supporting training and maintenance. Viewed through this picture, ERM decision makers face the challenge of identifying high-yielding bets, which is to say bets that reduce the most risk. The risk gaming metaphor, while suggestive, is insufficient on its own because it's static. Unlike bets and roulette wheels in a casino, roulette wheel spins in a casino, enterprises and societies can't reduce large-scale risks in a single instant. Rather, they deploy risk reduction measures over time. Typically, This requires preparatory activities, including R&D, building or procuring assets, and hiring and training personnel to operate those assets and processes. ERM resources are then deployed over time to cover populations against threats. These allocations cause risk to decline in those segments incrementally, while the costs to operate and maintain systems and sustain activities accumulate. So an ERM test drive model simulates these risk reduction activities, calculating their accruing benefits, costs, and ultimately ROI. But ERM test drive models are more than just glorified bookkeeping systems. Why? Well, remember that ERM activities occur in environments that are dynamic. Events, trends, and forces manifest while the ERM is being executed. These influences alter threat likelihoods and consequences. In many risk domains, some stakeholders, like terrorists, detect environmental changes, altering their behavior in response. So to recap, risk reduction is an inherently dynamic process. Bets play out over time, while the cells making up a risk gaming table grow and shrink in size, and sometimes even appear or disappear entirely. ERM test drives animate the playing of ERM games, projecting the performance of risk management decisions as realistically as possible. This picture summarizes the primary inputs and performance metrics for ERM decision test drive models. The details, which I'm not really going to go into much, vary across risk domains based on what data are available about targets and threats, what ERM measures are relevant, and what are the situation-specific dynamics. The most challenging performance metrics to model, realistically, are risk reduction and ROI. For most domains, the risk reduction expected from an ERM measure must be estimated subjectively by subject matter experts, like security analysts. Time precludes discussing this topic, but it deserves its own lecture. You can trust me on that. ROI is the most important and the most challenging performance metric. The most intuitive and naive method for calculating ROI is simply to divide the total risk reduced by total costs. Unfortunately, this value varies depending on exactly when you choose to measure it, and it almost always decreases. The reason is that analysts generally assume that risk decreases immediately and completely upon deploying an ERM measure, whereas costs continue to accrue over time, resulting in steadily decreasing ROI. To model risk dynamics more realistically, we define a metric we call cumulative ROI, which reduces sensitivity to the time of measurement. CROI draws an analogy to dieting. The value of a diet depends not only on how much weight you lose, but how long you manage to keep the weight off. Similarly, our CROI metric gives organizations credit not only for reducing risk, but keeping it reduced. So portfolio strategies get continuing credit for risk reduction, while expenditures to keep ERM measures in place continue to accumulate, since risk would otherwise rise again if those measures were withdrawn. We also defined a time efficiency metric to measure the relative speed for deploying ERM strategies. This is important because all other things being equal, it's better to reduce a population's exposure to risk sooner rather than later. Time efficiency provides a crucial metric for tracking and comparing how fast ERM portfolio decisions reduce risk relative to one another. Not surprisingly, ERM performance metrics often conflict. For example, measures that reduce lots of risk may also incur high costs for a mediocre ROI, while a strategy that offers superior risk reduction might be slow to do so. So simple judgments of optimality are rarely possible. And commonly, decision makers must make difficult trade-offs between these metrics. In addition, they must often factor in political considerations. For example, suppose you tighten security procedures in airport screening lines. Well, that's going to tend to slow down the throughput or operational efficiency. And so that's going to anger travelers, airlines, their lobbyists, and politicians. So thus far, I've described test drive models for ERM decisions in broad architectural terms. Now I'll briefly review a specific model that's tailored to manage risk from terrorist threats and then wrap things up. My company developed test drive solutions for 3 client groups within the Department of Homeland Security. Each one's responsible for defending a different national transportation network. So the Coast Guard covers maritime security, protecting the nation's ports, waterways and coasts, waterside facilities, and vessels. The Domestic Aviation Division in TSA defends commercial airports and aircraft, while the Highway Motor Carrier Group, or HMC, another unit within TSA, secures our nation's roadways by regulating the fleets of commercial trucks and buses that travel them. Each group collects distinct sets of risk data for their mode and developed their ERM approaches independently. So our test drive models vary in how they define risk exposure segments and project risk reduction, although their metrics and simulation logic are quite similar. Today, I'll focus on the HMC solution. I'll start with a design of the risk gaming table for HMC. All the highway vehicles regulated by TSA can be broken down into 4 classes: commercial trucks, hazmat, hazardous material trucks, commercial buses, and school buses. We partition them by the fleet size of the companies that own them. Size matters in this case because larger companies tend to have more security resources and tighter policies, which reduces threat likelihoods. So this exercise produced 18 target populations of HMC-regulated vehicles with distinct threat properties. Next, HMC analysts identified 13 threat scenarios, essentially terrorist attack modes, grouped into 2 families. Attack 1, the mode 1 is attackers use a regulated highway vehicle as a weapon against a non-HMC target, such as a crowd, building, or piece of critical infrastructure. So you commandeer a bus, for example. Family 2, attackers use a VBIED weapon against an HMC vehicle as the target. VBIED simply stands for Vehicle-Based Improvised Explosive Device, which is a weapon of up to 4,000 pounds TNT equivalent. So mapping these 13 threat scenarios against relevant target populations produces a risk gaming table containing 44 segments. Okay, HMC security analysts defined 8 measures for reducing risk from the 13 scenarios. They do multiple duty. Examples include running background checks on vehicle drivers, conducting security training for drivers, and installing remote monitoring and shutoff devices on vehicles. So a risk reduction measure is specified with 3 ingredients plus something called a fault tree. The deployment schedule simply specifies how many resource units will be rolled out per quarter to cover members of one of those 18 population segments. So we chose calendar quarter as the atomic unit of time, basically the clock tick for the test drive simulations. A cost schedule specifies the estimated cost for deploying and sustaining one resource unit for a reduction measure. Our accounting model employs 3 buckets to capture the full decision lifecycle costs: one-time capital and startup expenses, labor for operations, and costs for maintenance and repair. It turns out that HMC and the owner-operators of the vehicle fleets both shoulder some of these expenses, so this test drive requires 2 sets of these 3 buckets. The third spec specifies the reduction in risk anticipated from rolling out 1 unit of the ERM measure. Risk reduction is estimated in terms of the measure's effectiveness at detecting or interdicting an attack for each relevant threat scenario. So I'm going to go through this real quickly. Fault tree models terrorist attack as discrete steps in a process. So for example, suppose you want to use a school bus as a weapon. Well, first you've got to acquire the materials and the skills to build the bomb, and you have to buy, rent, or steal a school bus, and so on. So each of the security measures I talked about attaches to one of the nodes of the tree and injects its estimated effectiveness at reducing the likelihood of a successful attack. The simulator combines all of these piecemeal effects from all the leaf nodes to compute the net reduction in threat likelihood and applies this value to compute the risk reduced for the current cycle. The real takeaway here is that fault trees offer a fine-grained causal model of where and how security measures act to reduce risk from attacks and how to combine them quantitatively. So this is actually the summary representation of an example ERM portfolio decision. Each row basically specifies part of the bet for placing chips on cells in the risk gaming table over time. In 2012, HMC had a budget of roughly $8 million for risk reduction, so program managers wanted to know how far this pot of money would go. To answer this question, we test drove 3 distinct portfolios to map out a range of outcomes for alternative decisions. This represents an extreme money is no object strategy. It produces the lowest cumulative ROI. So here you apply all relevant risk reduction measures to cover all population segments. Not surprisingly, this is abysmally inefficient. Gives you a CROI of 0.004. By contrast, the highest yielding decision produces a CRI of 8.7. So for every dollar you spend, you get roughly $9 worth of cumulative risk reduced. This strategy was to apply only the most cost-effective measures to cover only those segments with high risk per population member. However, this decision is politically a non-starter because it ignores segments with the largest populations of vehicles. And this would undoubtedly trigger outrage by stakeholders, including fleet owners, parents of school children, and legislators. So a third decision crafted a compromise by allocating resources more broadly. Security measures are applied to segments until they hit a threshold. And so what happens is nearly all segments receive some coverage, which is politically a more palatable option. So very briefly, this graph magnifies the left portion of the previous curve. And I show this to highlight how rapidly ROI drops off for counterterrorism spending for HMC. The steepest bend is around $4 million, while the curve levels off fully at $20 million. Recall that HMC oversees vast fleets of vehicles, millions of trucks, and tens of thousands of school buses traveling across enormous networks of roadways. This test drive highlights how difficult it is to reduce risk, much less cost effectively, in this domain. So you see here that full coverage is $16 billion, whereas a high ROI requires a cumulative cost of only $3.5 million. And note that government's not picking up much of the tab, because all HMC does is formulate policies and regulate policies, regulate compliance. So industry is picking up the tab. In TSA, by contrast, they pick up most of the enormous cost for commercial airport security. So this is just a dual bar chart showing the initial risk and the residual risk after the strategy is applied. And you can see that our measure has reduced risk noticeably in several areas. These time series charts plot the key performance metrics for our 3 portfolio strategies over a 5-year period. So how much risk is reduced, total cost by counting category, cumulative ROI, and time efficiency. The point here is that decision makers will look at these kinds of outputs, ponder them, maybe ask more questions, which generates more test drives, do their comparisons of portfolio decisions, and then perform the trade-offs to make their choice. So let's wrap things up. Decision test drives, as I've sort of plowed through this material, clearly require considerable thought and effort. So the obvious question is, why should decision makers subject themselves to this kind of ordeal? And the answer is that competing methods are inherently inferior. So let's take a leading alternative, predictive analytics, for an example. So predictive analytics extrapolate the likely outcome for a decision at one future instant. So this approach basically reduces the analysis of projected outcomes to studying before and after snapshots. So the problem is predictive analytics is too coarse. They offer no visibility into how the elements of a critical decision contribute to desired outcomes, when those benefits will be realized, and how contingencies mid-execution might affect them. In fact, you can't even define comparative metrics that accumulate nonlinear, like risk reduced, CROI, and time efficiency. So you're completely blind to all this stuff. By contrast, decision test drives generate an entire movie rather than discrete snapshots. And you can edit the original movie script in untold ways using dynamic scenarios, reshoot the movie, and compare outcomes frame by frame if necessary. So test drives thereby produce insights in the dynamics and causality behind executing decisions, and this is critical to reducing exposure to uncertainty and improving outcomes. So to recap, critical decisions pose high stakes for organizations and careers alike. Improving critical decisions requires bending the law of unintended consequences. To do this, you've got to combat both of its causes, cognitive biases and bounded rationality, across the entire decision-making process. And our test drive method leverages best practices, decision modeling templates, and powerful modeling and simulation techniques to accomplish this task. So the bottom line, test drives essentially enable leaders to practice decisions and learn safely from virtual rather than real mistakes. They help leaders identify decisions that are robust despite rampant uncertainty about the future and other bounds of rationality. And they improve decision outcomes by detecting emerging problems during execution, enabling leaders to make effective mid-course corrections. So this is a view of my book. A lot of the ideas that I've talked about today are given a kinder, gentler presentation in my blog, which is on the site. There's a complimentary book preview and summary that you can download. And there are two demo videos of test drives for two other kinds of decisions. I've also added 2 pages of references to the slide deck to provide you with some entries into the relevant literature. Thanks for bearing with me.
Thanks very much, Rich. You've given us a lot to think about.